give you an overview of what we're going to cover in today's webinar, just so you have a sense of the things we'll talk about, so you know what to wait for. And it's all about shooting portraits and processing portraits and taking advantage of how you can maybe start off with a better image, some tricks and techniques, as well as, even things such as, what's the right focal length for your lens that's going to make somebody look good. So we'll talk a little bit about good shooting practices. And I'm shooting all this with the Fujifilm T3. It's a really fun camera because I can do some processing in the camera. And I also have the option of, getting those raw images and taking them over and processing them with the DxO PhotoLab software and Nik and whatnot. So we'll talk a little bit about shooting and processing, and then we'll step into, well, the processing part. And I know everybody doesn't start off with the same software. And the nice thing about the Nik plugins is they work beautifully inside of the DxO PhotoLab software, but also in Photoshop and Lightroom. So I'll briefly show you how you can access these plugins from both of those applications, and then we'll actually walk through and give you an idea of how you can quickly make an image pop or stylize an image and get nice portraits with only a few clicks. So that's the objective. I'll probably be showing you some behind the scenes shots to show you some problems so we can talk about some solutions. And then, of course, if you have questions, you can type them in throughout the webinar. Lori will be answering some of those directly online. And then at one point in the webinar, we'll actually go and she'll read me some of the questions, and I will attempt to show you those solutions and talk a little bit about either photography solutions when capturing the image or processing the image. So I wanted to talk to you first just about shooting and things. Now, you can see in this screen grab here that, it's not a big photo studio. I just hung up a black backdrop. And I have a couple lights here, and I just want to talk about the idea of soft light. And that's one of the key things that you may want if you're going to be shooting a portrait. There are times when you want a hard light, a lot of times men, more dramatic stuff, but we want skin to look soft. And the trick is to have a larger light source. And whether you're using an on-camera flash or taking that on-camera flash and making that, taking it off and putting it to the side. So you're using some kind of a strobe, portable strobe, or a studio strobe. The thing is, if you don't put any kind of a modifier in front of it, that light gets very hard and you're going to have very harsh shadows, and it will also show any flaws in a person's skin. So if you can clean up that by your lighting, you'll be that much further ahead of the game when you start taking your images in for post-processing. So if you just look at this image here, I have several different modifiers that I want to talk about. On the far right of your screen, and you'll see there's a large umbrella. This is a shoot-through umbrella. As a matter of fact, let me bring this full screen so we can really focus on it. So I have a strobe here. You can't really see it, but by shooting through this umbrella, it takes that small 3-inch light source and makes it much larger and softer. And what's nice about this is that you'll get much more gradual shadows on the person's face. And because it's softer, you won't see some of the flaws in some of their pores. Now you can use a shoot-through umbrella. The nice thing is it throws light everywhere. If you needed to control the light a little bit more, and in this case, I had a black background, so it wasn't as much of an issue, you can take a look at the modifier up on the upper left side. And this is referred to as a softbox, and they can be square or round. They can go onto a speed light. They can go onto a strobe. And again, it has diffusion in the front, but you'll notice that the umbrella part is black. And so I'm able to control where the light is hitting and where it's not hitting. So if I didn't want it to light up the background, I could point it in the direction of my talent and still get that very soft light on their skin. Now, we could spend easily an hour or probably a day talking about different ways you can diffuse light, but these are some things to keep in mind. In my hand, I have an on-camera flash. I tend not to like on-camera flashes just because it doesn't create any kind of a shadow or modeling, and it gives more of a flat image. But even if I have to use that, I like to put some type of diffusion on it. And as you can see in this image, that I have a little globe on it. And that's going to take that hard light and soften it a little bit. And to my right, the model's holding what's called a beauty dish. And this is, again, another way that you can get soft light, but very focused. And if I slide this ahead a little bit, you might be able to see where she turns the dish a little bit. So this is the video that we're going to be putting out, but this is basically a black dish with a nice soft light there. The other thing I wanted to point out, and let's see if I can go back to that wide shot again, I'll go over to the right a little bit, is that if I don't have any lights, you know, window light can be great because think of it as a very large softbox. So as long as the light's not, you know, shining right in, creating a very harsh shadow, that window light can create, again, very soft light on a person's face. And so you don't necessarily need all this gear. You just need a way to diffuse light. If there's a curtain or a sheer in the window, pulling that back sometimes will also soften the light. That's really your goal when you are taking an image, is to soften that light. Now I'm going to go ahead and close this, and I want to point out another thing. Let me go ahead and just quit my QuickTime Movie. There we are, they're in Lightroom, but I want to go over here to my desktop. I will hide this. You can see some of the apps that we'll be using. And I want to point out here, and I have a little thing, I believe I have some backup images of some other challenging environments. But when shooting outside, sometimes you have the same challenges. And being able to use a softbox, if you can take lights outside, can also help a lot. So let's go back. I'm going to open up all of the images that I shot here, and I should be able to find a couple of really bad ones. Actually, here's the secret of being a good photographer. You take a lot of images and you show them only the best 3%. And then everybody thinks everything is brilliant. But the truth is you're going to get a lot of strange shots. Here's an interesting challenge I had. Again, I shot this earlier, and I wanted to do some with and some without lights. And you can see later on, I have what I did is I actually shot in a garage. And what was interesting is it was very bright outside. And instead of having the person stand outside, I put them in the garage so the light that was coming in was diffused and it lit them. So it lit, this is not the sharpest one. I think I was just doing some test shots here, but it lit them. I did bring a light in. I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can light them. And then I can move them forward and back inside the garage to show how much light would be on them. And then I just hung up a black background behind them, and I was able to work with this. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And another thing to keep in mind, and I have some shots here where we went outside and we shot. And here we go. Did I get the wide here? So this was between two buildings, and I'm going to check again to see if I can find that. Maybe I threw it in here for examples. I want to talk about this in just a moment. But the sun was really strong outside, but this was between two houses, and one house was providing shadow to the second house's wall. And again, that gave me softer light. So the model wasn't, you know, squinting their eyes, and it wasn't harsh. So the takeaway here is that if you can find a shadowed area, often that's better to shoot under than if you have bright light. So look for that if you're outside. And the other thing is that if it is bright, don't hesitate to use a flash if you have it to either fill in or in some cases to combat the sun. So you can actually expose for the flash and not the sun, and you can control what happens with the light. So those are some just things that you can do to capture better light. I have one last set of images I wanted to point out. And a lot of times, if you're shooting somebody in front of a window or a sunset, this is the result you're getting. So if you wanted the person to be exposed, what would happen is the windows would get really blown out. So the trick is, when shooting somebody in front of a window or in front of a sunset, you expose for the background, you expose for the how much light's coming through the window or how bright or dark the background is, and then you bring in your strobe or your flash and then use that and make that setting just light them up. So we could see here that we lit for the background and then I lit for the person. And that way I was able to get that image. And I'll talk about some of this in the video that we'll be releasing. So that's a basic idea when shooting an image that you can do to get things better in the way of lighting. The other thing I want to point out is, what lens should you use? And let's see if I can open up the metadata for all of these photographs. And if I click on metadata, you can see here I was using the X-T3, and these were the lenses I was using. Let's see if I can zoom in on that, because I do want to point out that the lens you use, and I did use a few different lenses, is important for getting a good portrait. And the thing that I like to use is a more telephoto lens. Depending on what kind of camera you're shooting with, some of you may be shooting with a full frame, some of you may be shooting with a crop frame. So I'm going to give you two sets of numbers. So if you're shooting with a full frame camera, 50 millimeter is basically what the eye sees, and that's very natural. And I very rarely shoot portraits with less than a 50 millimeter lens because I don't want that distortion, that wide angle effect on somebody's face, or their legs getting too long or their arms getting too long. It just can be a little bit crazy. Now, that's on a full frame sensor. Now, I was using a crop frame on this Fujifilm camera. So it's a 1:6, a 1x6, a 1.6 times crop factor. So a 35 millimeter lens on that camera gives me the feel of a 50. Okay, so that's some things to keep in mind. There are instances when I would use a wide angle lens if I'm doing some sort of environmental portrait where I really want to see where that person is in their background, whether maybe they're working in some sort of like a doctor's office and you're taking a headshot of a doctor and you want to show the background, or maybe it's an outside shot and you want to be able to show the background or the mountains, then I might use something wider, but that the person will only be a small part of the frame. So the lenses I like to use are an 85 millimeter on a full frame, and that translates to a 56 millimeter on a crop frame. Okay, so this is a little bit of a zoom, and what I like about this lens is it tends to flatten the features a little bit more. You don't get, like, if you shoot with a wide angle, noses can get big or eyes can get distorted. So people look better when you shoot them with a longer lens. So one of my go-to lenses, my favorite portrait lenses, in this case, it's the 56 millimeter. That's the equivalent of an 85 to shoot portraits. But sometimes I'll also go to a longer lens. You'll see them as 70 to 200s if you're shooting full frame. If you're shooting, let's go see if I have some of those that I shot here, shot long. And I think I have some down here where I shot some nice long lens stuff. I'm going to just click on these. We can look at the metadata over here to the right. And I was using the focal length of a 50. So this was my zoom lens. And the 50 was the equivalent of the 85. See, I naturally drew myself to that. And there we go, 140 millimeters. That's like a 200 millimeter lens. So I get further away, but the portrait often looks better. So this brings me to the third and final part of what I want to talk to you about when it comes to selecting, not only the light and the lens, but also when you want to control your depth of field. And you do that, there's a couple of things that affect depth of field. The primary thing is the aperture, or how wide open or closed your lens is. So for instance, if the lens is very open, and you'll see that's like a number like 2.0, 1.8, 1.4. Those are pretty wide. And close would be like, say, f16, f22. The difference is when you have a smaller aperture, that would be, for instance, f22, your depth of field is pretty wide. So everything in the foreground and the background, as well as your the person you're taking the portrait of, is going to be in focus. If you go to a more shallow depth of field, say shooting at 1.4 or 2.0, that depth of field is going to get much, much more shallow. So for instance, if I open up this image here, you can see that she is in sharp focus, but the bricks start going out of focus. And if I scroll down here, I should be able to see what my aperture was. I was shooting this with a long lens. This is probably an f4, but the two things that affect my depth of field is a lower number for my aperture, and if you're more zoomed in, so you're using more of a telephoto lens, that will also affect your depth of field and giving you a more shallow depth of field. And why do you want this? Because a lot of times the background can be distracting. And if you're distracted by the background, you're not really looking at the person. So that's why people tend to want to shoot with a very shallow depth of field and often a very small aperture number. Sometimes down to 1.2, some of these lenses will go. And I want to put a caveat on that because our knee-jerk reaction is, oh, I want a nice buttery background, a nice buttery bokeh, so I'm going to dial it down to 1.2 and take the picture. The challenge when you get too low of a aperture, too low of a number, which is a wide open aperture, is sometimes that depth of field can be as shallow as 1/4 of an inch. And so one eye might be in focus, but the other eye might not. And that's a little distracting if that's not your intent. So even with these very wide open lenses, I would generally not go below f2 because I want to make sure the person's entire face is in focus. And most lenses also work a little bit better when you step away from the extremes. So you might get a lens, for instance, the 56mm was a 1.2, which is really wide, but shooting it at 1.8 or 2.0, it becomes really, really sharp where I want it to be sharp. And the same thing goes true on the other end with the lens. It might go up to f22, closing it down so that you can leave your shutter open longer, but it may not be as sharp at the extreme as it is, as say, f18. So those are some things to keep in mind, just to kind of refresh that. Wider apertures, which are lower numbers, will give you a more shallow depth of field and give you a more stylistic photo, and also defocus the background if it's distracting. And another thing is, if you use a longer lens, you generally get a nicer image of the person, as well as you can again shorten that depth of field. As a matter of fact, I highly recommend that there's a lot of great apps for phones out there on both Android and iOS that are depth of field calculators, and you plug in the camera you're using and it tells you the sensor size, you type in the lens, and then you can say, okay, if I set it at aperture 2.0 and they're 15 feet away, what's my depth of field? So you can actually see, are you going crazy by making it too shallow, or is it perfect? And those are usually just a couple of bucks. So depth of field calculators, probably one of the best things you can download on your phone as a photographer. So with that said, let's talk a little bit about image processing and some of the styles. So, a lot of times, depending on your camera, and in this case, I was using the T3, is that some cameras actually let you do some processing directly inside the camera. I'm going to go ahead and show this entire reel, or roll of film, as I would have called it. So here you can see the lenses that I was using. So this is a crop sensor. So if you look at the top of my screen, that 35 is equal to like a 50mm, and it's pretty fast. The 56 is equivalent to an 85mm, and then this 50 to 140 is similar to a 70 to 200. Okay, so if you're looking at these numbers, if you have a crop sensor, these are the sizes that I recommend for different styles of portraits. And of course, if you're full frame, those are the other numbers: 50, 85, 135 is another nice one. And also a 70 to 200 in this case, it's a 50 to 140. So what was fun about this is that a lot of times you can set up your camera to shoot both JPEG and RAW. And ideally, you always want to shoot RAW because it gives you so much more information to work with. But there are times when JPEG has been beneficial to me. Sometimes I just need to shoot a bunch of images. I don't have time to process them. I need to upload them to a news service or give them to somebody for review. So it's nice being able to set your camera up to shoot both JPEG and RAW. You can see here I was doing a lot of light testing so I could give you good and bad versions of images. But what I want to point out, and let's see if I can switch just over to JPEG here. So here we have some of just our JPEG images. You'll notice that some of my JPEGs here, and I was playing with some of the settings inside of the T3 where you could just do color isolation right in there. But I can shoot things, you know, in black and white, and the raw image was still the full set of information, and that was really kind of nice. I'm going to jump over here because I want to show for webinar selects. Is that what I wanted to show? I have lots of images to work with. And one of the things you can do, and I'm going to switch back for not just those images, but all my photographs. Look at the metadata. I want to show all my file types. And I'm going to scroll down here because there's a couple of tricks that I like to do when I'm shooting a portrait, especially if that portrait is going to ultimately be in black and white. So let's see if I have that info. Here we go. So this is kind of cool. You can set up your camera to have a color style sometimes. If you go through the menu, you can say, oh, I want the colors to pop, or I want a black and white image. In the those of you who are using the Fuji cameras, you know, there's a Pro Negative standard is one that I like to use, and the other ones are Eterna. It's a very natural look. So I like those, and what happens is I could put those out if I knew I was going to send off a black and white right away. So I got the JPEG and I have the RAW. So if you look here, there's the JPEG, and that's black and white with all the processing. There's the RAW if I need to take that in. But another great way that you can leverage this is sometimes I know I want an image to be in black and white when I process it. And what I can do is when I'm looking at the back of the camera and the eyepiece and I shoot it, it shows you the JPEG. So I see this image with the black and white tonality, but I still have the RAW that I can work with. And that's, you know, a really cool way that you can leverage your camera to give you that much more information in the field. And for all the photographers out there that have worked with models, you probably are very familiar with, I just had the shot of them basically looking at their phone a lot as you're setting up your light. So it wasn't a phone commercial, it was just simply me setting up my lights and she was just reflecting it. So with that said, that's a lot on the photographic side, or the shooting side. Let's take a look at some of the processing options and how we can very quickly work with some of these. I did isolate some of these images. I have my selects, and let's go ahead and process these. And I'm going to do it a couple of ways. I'm in Lightroom right now. So the nice thing about working in Lightroom is I can, if I wanted to, take an image, and I'm going to double click to open it up. And I like this image. Let's see what this one looks like. No, I think the smile's good. This is actually, I like the feel of this. This is good. This, by the way, was shot with, you know, it was a smaller aperture. So I have a lot of depth of field here. So everything is in focus. It's very different than that previous one I showed you. And that's how you can control it. But if I wanted to, I could do some pre-processing here directly in Lightroom. If this was underexposed or overexposed, I could go in and modify it, maybe open up the shadows if I wanted to. So I could process this, you know, just a starting point. I want to add a little texture here so I have some clarity. And now I want to take advantage of my Nik plugins. So to do that, all I have to do is once I've adjusted the picture, if it needed adjustment, I can right click in Lightroom and say edit in, and there are all of my Nik plugins. But let's go ahead and we'll start with, and then we're going to also look at Color Efex Pro. But Color Efex Pro is great because I can very quickly stylize an image and create something I like. So once I've done anything I needed to do inside of Lightroom, I would right click, select that plugin, and then I'm given these choices, and the defaults are fine. What's going to do is it's going to grab any adjustments I made and it's going to edit a copy. It's going to create that TIFF file. You can see down at the bottom of my screen, it actually created a duplicate file here, so you're not affecting the primary image. I'm going to hit the F key, so now Color Efex Pro is full screen, and I'm ready to start processing the image. Now, what I really like about this plugin is I can get some really cool looks with just a click, and sometimes that's all I need and I'm done. I can also go to a very fine level of just putting on specific filters. So let's take a look at what we have. I'm going to click up here in the upper left-hand corner. This is the filter library, and there are a lot of filters to work with. And if you click on any of these, it's going to affect the image. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you first open any of these plugins, the way they're designed, and this is actually pretty cool, is you can call this like a sticky filter. I think that's might not be the technical term, but it will open up with the last filter you were working with on the previous image, which is nice if you have a bunch of images to work with and stylistically you're doing things over and over and just tweaking it. So that's why it had this one. I could go ahead and delete it by hitting that X key, but I want to show you how applying a single filter works. So if there's a filter here and I say, oh, you know what, I just want to try something different. I want to add I want to put on the high key filter. Whenever I select a filter, it replaces the filter that is there, the most recent filter. So I didn't have to delete it. I can just go ahead and I can say, oh, maybe I want to do darken and lighten center. So right here, you can see that this is something maybe I wanted to do. I wanted to just darken the outer area, and it creates what I like is as kind of a really nice vignette around the person. And I want to show you a little bit deeper how these work. So I could switch between these, but notice as I hover over any of my filters, to the right of that, there's a little box. And if you click on that box, there are several different variations of that filter. In this case, there's 3, sometimes there's 4, sometimes there's 6. So I could say, I like this, but you know what? What if I really wanted maximum depth? And you notice it's now much brighter in the center. Or I wanted the reverse. I wanted to brighten the edges. I like that look. You'll notice as I switch between each of these by clicking on them, not only is the image affected, but if you look over here to the right, so are these sliders. I'm going to do that again so you can see the sliders change when I click. Okay, so the nice thing is you can select these and you might love it right out of the box, or if you want to tweak it, you can, and it's very easy to do. So I get something close to what I like, and I think the default is pretty close. I can then select where I want that center of the effect to be, because she's not really dead center inside the frame. So now it's really kind of doing what I want. And then I could tweak this. I could go ahead and I could change its size. I could make it darker. If she was too blown out, I could bring that down. And I've now refined the filter to give me the look that I want. I have a couple of ways to look at the before and after. Now, I only have one filter on here, so I could just go over to compare, and that's going to show me the image that was brought in and the modification with the filter. That's what I use mostly. But sometimes you want to see a side by side, and depending on your screen layout, you could click on this little button in the center. It's a set of arrows if you want them side by side or top or bottom. Sometimes if you're shooting portrait or landscape, switching between those is easier. I could also just get a little slider here, and it's always good to go back and forth and see where you came from and where you are. So that's how I would start comparing the images. So I like this, and I'm going to go back and I want to add another filter. Well, we learned earlier on in the webinar that if I just click on another filter, I'll click on Glamour Glow, it replaced the filter that was there, which I wanted to do when we first started, but I don't necessarily want to do it now. I want to add a filter. So don't worry if you ever make a mistake. If you look at the very bottom of the left-hand corner of the screen, you can see there's something called history. And if I click on that, this is all the stuff that I just did. So if I messed up and I wanted to go back to before where I messed up or see what I did, very easy to do. So I'm going to go back to this step right here. See, I could go back even all the way to the original image. So I go back here, that was my history, and let me go back to my filter library. And if I wanted to add another filter, but keep this one here, there's an add filter button. Now I know some of you might have been using the Nik plugins for a while. So I always like to throw in an advanced trick. So if I hit add filter, I have an empty space. And then for instance, in this case, maybe I do want to add a little bit of softening. So I'll scroll down and it's maybe some Glamour Glow. There we go. And again, with the Glamour Glow, all these different feels, okay? So I like this. That's kind of very cool. I like the warmer one. I like what it did to the bricks. You'll notice now I have these two sets of filters and I can go in and look at them individually by clicking on them to reveal, or if I wanted to, I could also turn on different effects. Now, here's the interesting thing. I want to talk about control points because I like what this is doing to some parts of my image, but I think it's really kind of washing out her face. And so you have the option to add control points to say what part of the image is going to be affected by this filter and what part of the image won't be affected by this filter. I'm going to add a minus control point. And I'm going to click on her face and I'm going to click on the skin here. You notice very quickly that, and if I zoom in here, I can do that by clicking on this little button right here. That'll zoom me into 100%. If you want to zoom into different zoom factors, there's that drop down. So maybe I'll go into 200% and we'll go to the face here. So what I did is I created this control point, and you'll notice that there's, when I click on it, there's a little circle around it, okay? That is what area is going to be affected by either adding a control point that brings something in at 100% opacity, or in this case, removing it. And I can change the size of that with this little slider here. So it's only going to affect that area, but it's a lot smarter than that. A lot of times you may be in other programs and you have to create a mask and you're drawing shapes and whatnot. What the control points do with its area of influence is it looks at the saturation, the color, the hue, the texture of where that little control point dot is, and only selects things that would relate to that. And I can see exactly what it's selecting. If I go over here to the control points, I'm going to click on this little triangle, and this will disclose more information. There's my control point, and there's a little button right here. And if I click on that, it says show hide selection of the control point. Okay, and that's another great feature I like about these plugins, is that if you don't know what something does, a lot of times just hover your mouse over it, it will give you a hint. So I'm going to click on that, and what you can see is the forehead is now really dark. So the way masks work is if something is light, it means that effect is being applied to that area. If it's dark, it's not. So you notice here, it is applying or removing the glow from her skin up here, because that's my area of influence, based upon what I selected. And if I wanted to make sure the rest of her face isn't affected, I could add new control points, click on them and adjust them. Or here's a nice little trick. If you hold down the Option key on a Mac or the Alt key in Windows, and I click on that control point, I can duplicate it and drag it over here to another part of her face. And if I want, I can shrink this down a little bit. Okay, so right now, I can see exactly where this filter is affecting and where it's not. And I kind of think this should work okay. I'm going to turn this off. And there we can see if I come out to, let's just go out to full screen. So I'm affecting the part of the face there. And I don't need to have these selected. There's my different control points. If I turned off my control points, you would see her face is now affected by the entire filter. So I would go down here and turn these off. You see she's a little blown out. Okay, and let's go ahead and turn that on. So that's the nice thing. So if I turn off the filter, it's here, but then I get this really cool warm brick, and she's not being blown out as much by that. Now, the nice thing is about these control points is I can go back and click on any of them. And in addition to the size, there's also an opacity slider. So I could say, yeah, you know, I don't like it really bright on her face. Maybe I'll bring back a little bit of this effect because I don't want her skin to look that much cooler. So this is one way that you can use control points. Let's go ahead and work with this a little bit more. I'm going to zoom in back to her face, and I want to add another filter. And a filter that I really like, especially when doing a portrait, is if you look out here, there is a, sorry, I need to take a quick sip of water. Is I want to do some skin softening, and there it is, the dynamic skin softener. Sometimes it's hard to find what you're looking for because there's so many great filters to work with. So you'll notice if you look up here that a lot of, there's other click boxes here, and if I click on them, it will filter my filters. So these are all film effects. These are all things you might use for wedding photography. There is that dynamic skin softener. This is maybe if I'm doing architecture, okay, or travel or landscapes. I want these kind of cool looks, or portrait. So there again, it's dynamic skin softener. So that's a quick way to find the filters you want. There's also a button that says favorites, and right now it's empty. But if I go back over here to portrait, I can say, you know what? I use dynamic skin softener a lot. I like that. I also like classical soft focus. And maybe I want to use a little bit of a skylight filter or a sunlight filter. Those are things I like, and some tonal contrast, maybe a vignette. And I'll go over to wedding. You notice as I clicked on these, they turned yellow. They're yellow here also in the wedding side, but there's also some other ones that I might use, such as a white neutralizer if you have a color cast. So these might become my favorite ones to work with. Now, if I click on favorites, they're all right there and I don't have to hunt as hard. So that's great. Now, let's take a quick peek at working with that dynamic skin softener. So I wanted to apply this. I told you, you could do add filter, but I promised an advanced shortcut for those who have been using this. If you hold down the Shift key before you select a filter, it will automatically add that filter instead of replacing it. So if you notice, I hit the skylight filter, didn't want to do that. So let me undo that. What I wanted was dynamic skin, hold down the Shift key, dynamic skin softener. And this is a great filter to fix skin tone. And the nice thing is it's not super aggressive. You can really control how it works. And again, it really takes advantage of these control points. So the first thing I like to do is tell it what color her skin is. It comes up with kind of a generic skin tone, but I can click on this little eyedropper and then I can select her skin tone. And I click on that. You'll notice it did get soft a little bit, and this color changed because she's rather pink right here. So what do these sliders do? Well, color reach is an important one because as I move that over to the right, it expands the threshold or the range of colors to the left and right of pink. So a little more red would probably be added and a little more orange. So it's widening the area of what it considers the skin tone. You don't want to go crazy because it'll pick up bricks and everything. You notice I do that. The bricks are getting soft. As a matter of fact, I'm going to throw up all of my softening way beyond what you would normally use because I want you to see that it really is starting to affect other parts of this image. It's not just doing her skin tone. So color reach is important, not to overdo that. Okay, so again, I've done this in the extreme. Let me dial it back. And all you're doing here with these sliders is you're controlling whether it's softening large details, medium details, or small details in the skin, and play with these. And I recommend this when using any slider and learning any filter, is just drag it all the way to the extremes right and left, just to get a feel for what it does. So we have this dynamic skin softener. There it is, with and without. And it is affecting the walls here, because there's still some pink there. It affects the whole image. So what I want to do is use my control points and just again select her skin. Now I'm going to do this one at a time, but there is a really cool feature that, with the Glamour Glow, I did select her face already with control points. So if you go to this little drop down here, I can actually copy those control points from a previous filter. And then I could go down here and paste those control points on her. So here we have the control points. I don't want them to be, now the location's great, but remember, I was trying to remove things, so I had a low opacity. Here I want a high opacity, or completely opaque, which means the filter is being applied to all of the areas based upon where it's floating. So I'm going to go here, the color reach, get that nice and soft. Okay, and then I'm going to add control points because I only want it to be, say, here on her forehead. And then I want to control the size of it. And then I will option drag. And again, when I do this, so I know that I'm getting the right spots, I like going over here and pressing this little box, highlighting this box, and it shows me the white area, which is where this filter is affecting my image. And I don't want to go crazy. I do want a little detail in the nose, but maybe I will go over here a little bit and scale that down, and maybe a little bit on the chin. And remember how we had negative control points in the previous filter? Well, if for some reason I think it's softening too much or outside of that, this is another great opportunity to add a negative control point. So if I click here, do you see it's looking at everything that's dark, and now it's not going to affect the hair at all, won't soften that. I could hit another negative. We could choose the brick. So now I'm really isolating the face, and I can go ahead and option or alt drag and really very quickly get a mask that's only going to affect her skin, not her eyes and not the brick. And when I turn this back on, so now we see that her skin is now much softer. I'm going to toggle this on and off. Okay. And so there I've been able to soften this. And the trick is, when softening skin, is you don't want it to be so plastic that it doesn't look like, a real person. If I wanted to, I could even then go ahead, make sure that the eyes aren't done, or I could go here and add detail so the eyes are sharper. And that'll be the last thing I do in this image. And we'll take a quick look at the before and the after. So what I want to do is I want to add a little bit of detail. Again, with all of these, I can go through and apply this. And you can see the detail is killing her skin tone. But maybe what I want is I really just want that detail in the eyes. So I'm going to just crank up the detail. And once again, go to my control points, click on her right eye, which is on our left. Bring down the size of that just so it's right over the eye. Alt drag, option drag to the other eye. If I looked at what this is affecting, just the eyes. If I didn't want it to, if it's getting some other areas, I can go ahead and make sure that we're only affecting the eyeballs and the eyebrows. Turn that off. And now her eyes are sharper. If we go back to full screen, I'm going to zoom out. It takes a second to process. You can see that this is our final image. I'm just showing you the filters we put on there. And then if I compare that, I get something quite different. And that's really nice. And then when I'm done, all I have to do is hit save, and it will save back to my Lightroom catalog. Now, I do want to point one thing out before I hit save, and I touched on this before, is that, if I like this, I can save this as a recipe. And what a recipe is, as a matter of fact, I'll save this as I'll call this outdoor portrait. Hit OK. So now it's saved it as a recipe, a custom recipe. But if I click on back, when you install the Nik plugins, there are some sample recipes that are already in here. So what a recipe is instead of applying a single filter, when I click on it, it will apply a variety of filters. It warns you, unless you turn it off, that it's going to replace all the filters I had. I'm going to say OK, because I want to just show you how some of these little presets are pretty cool and might get you stylistically what you want. But I do want to point out that if there's some aspect you don't like, such as maybe the bleach bypass is a little bit heavy, I could dial that back a little bit, or I could put in control points and maybe make sure her face doesn't get blown out. And of course, the reason I was so willing to do that is because I have all of this history. And with that history, I can simply go back to where it was, which was right there before I added the preset. That's where it was. I hit save. It is now going to save it back to my Lightroom catalog as a TIFF image, so I can continue to work with it or export it from my catalog. So that's an idea how Color Efex works. Let's take a quick peek at how Silver Efex work, because it's an amazing way to do really dynamic black and white images. And let's pick an image to work with. I like this one. This is nice. Again, I want to show you the metadata on this. If we look at the metadata on this image, shot that with an 85 millimeter equivalent, the 56 millimeter, 1.2, and I really was able to get a shallow depth of field where she's sharp. But if you notice, I'm not distracted by the background. In this case, I'm going to open this up in Photoshop. You can launch something in Lightroom. I could also, if I wanted to, take it into, and I just want to point out, DxO PhotoLab 3 is also a great solution that can come bundled with your software. So if you don't have Photoshop or Lightroom, you always have this as an option for developing your images using PhotoLab 3. And it's a great way to sort through things. But I want to show Photoshop for those who are using that, because it, again, has some really cool features. I can right click and I can say, edit in Adobe Photoshop. It's going to launch Photoshop and process this. It will open up whenever you launch something raw. This is all okay. There we go, there's my image. So it's done that. Let's bring this full screen. I'm gonna hit Control or Command 0 to make the image full screen. So there's my image that I wanna work with. And I have a couple ways that I can attack this. I can apply the filter directly to this and launch. If I select that layer to work with and go here to filter, and then I can go to my Nik collection, and there's all my Nik plugins, and there's Silver Efex. So I can hand it off that way, and when I do this, it's actually going to put out a second layer with the filter effects on it. If I wanted to, for those of you who are familiar with smart objects, I could turn this into a smart object. And again, a lesson unto itself, but what a smart object allows you to do is when you apply things, you can step back inside and turn filters on and off, and it's very powerful. But for this example, I'm going to do it the traditional way. So there I have the background image. I'll go filter. I'm going to go Nik collection, and I'm going to choose Silver Efex Pro. And I've been using Silver Efex, I guess, easily for over 10 years. It's one of my favorite ways to create a black and white image, because the truth is there's a lot more to black and white than just desaturating your image. It's really how the tonality of the different colors are affected when you pull color from them. So that can be complex. So what I really like is there's great starting points. Just like you saw in Color Efex 4, there's lots of great little presets. And again, you can sort through these if you want to give it a vintage look. And you can literally just step through and say, what's the style I want? And soft sepia right there, I'd be pretty happy with that. I'm going to try to remember that for later on in the next 5 minutes of this webinar. Um, it'll remember the ones you recently used. You can look at all of them. You'll discover ones that work really well for different styles of images. So full dynamic range really opens things up. If I hit compare, it'll show me what a desaturated or a standard black and white looks like versus that specific filter. So this is nice. It's a good way to go, but I think I am going to go back because I want something a little bit softer here. I'm going to go back to soft sepia, and what it has done is it has applied a variety of settings to this image already. And I can go through this quickly, but if I like this and I want to tweak it, I can just start playing with some of these sliders. Maybe I want it to be a little bit brighter. So in this case, it was a really good starting point. Maybe, it's a little softer than I want. I can bring back structure, or I can keep it soft. And again, what's really nice is maybe I like the softness on her skin, but I want to give a little bit more edge to the jacket. So control points work a little differently in the different plugins. And that's because you have different needs. So if I click on control point and I click on the jacket, once again, it selects the area of influence the same way. But now I have some options here where I can do fine control. Before this is global across the whole image. Now I can just affect the jacket. So maybe I want to bring up the contrast in the jacket a little bit and bring up the structure so I see a little more detail there. And I can even click down and have some other options where I'm amplifying my whites, amplifying my blacks, adding a little bit of fine structure to it, and even can do selective color if I wanted to bring color back to one area. So this is great. And again, it works the same way. I can see what it's doing. It's adding detail to this area here based upon that area of influence. I could bring it down a little bit, but you notice it's not affecting or adding detail to her face, but it is to the eye. So anywhere it's white, it's good, or it's adding that extra little detail, and where it's black, it's not being affected. So that's great. But let's take a look at a couple more things and then I'll wrap this up, is that in addition to these controls, in the old days when people developed film in a analog film in a darkroom, when you develop black and white, you could put different color filters in front of the enlarger and different bands of light would come through onto your black and white image. So if I click, say, the red, it affects the image. If you notice, reds are not filtered the same way as if I did everything even, or orange. And you'll get used to this. So skin tone, red and orange are really good filters. Blue, very different. It gives me much harsher details. So I can go in here and play with those. And again, you can undo, you can go back in your history. So playing with this is good. If I want to give it more of a grunge look, all of these film stock, this is emulating all these different types of historical film that if you had shot with a black and white film here, you'll see some of these say new. This is in the latest release of the Nik plugins, but I can say, I want something a little grainy. So let me try this. And it added some grain to my image. There we go. I like it. It's giving it some strength and some depth. I could, again, play with these if I wanted to be a little bit more. And I could put different types of curves in. But then I like this. I'm just going to do some finishing adjustments, scroll down. It is giving me a little bit of a sepia, but I could print it on any style of paper I want. I could have a neutral white background. I'm a big fan of selenium. It's kind of a silvery look. That's a big one for me. And of course, I like coffee too, because it's not quite as yellow as some of the sepias, but we're going to give it a selenium tone. And I can then, I want to add a little bit of blurring, not necessarily blurring, I could add blurring to the edges, but just kind of a vignette. So you have traditional vignettes and all you have to do is hover over them. So this is a case where you could actually go washing it out to a white, but you could also do lens fall off. I like going in, and sometimes I'll mix these. So let me go back to off, that's off. But if I burn my edges, this is kind of an uneven way of doing it. And I think it gives me kind of more of a grungy natural. And so I could go there. I like that as soft. So this gives me a good on the left and the right. But one thing I want to point out is that if you open these little disclosure triangles, I can isolate and say, you know what, little too much being taken out here. I'm going to click on that dial back its strength and size. So I still have the burning on the left, right, and bottom, but not necessarily at the top. And then if I wanted to, I have all these image borders. So I could stylize it right there. I'm gonna not put a border on. I'm just gonna export this as I like it. So I'll hit OK. It's gonna throw this back, and the way I have it preset, it's gonna create a second layer. If you see, it's processing all of those filters I put on. So this is my before, this is my after, and the great thing is, because it's a layer in Photoshop, I could blend back, and sometimes I like to bring back just a little bit of transparency so there's a hint of color, but it still feels black and white. So this is just some of the fun things that you can do inside of the Nik plugins, as well as hopefully you walked away with some shooting ideas on how you can just think outside the box a little bit when shooting your portraits.